worldwide health emergency. We ask who's managing the Zika epidemic and what's being done to stop it. Also on today's program, the relentless rise of the megacity. More than half of humanity lives in urban areas. But is there a better alternative? And in Picture This, the power of suggestion. We take a look at the Superbowl's multi-million-dollar commercial lineup. Hello and welcome to the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garta. It's a virus that has mild symptoms and a low risk of death. You may not even notice that you have it, but it's being linked to a growing number of birth abnormalities in Brazil. And that's prompted the World Health Organization to label it a global health emergency. Cases have been reported across the Americas. And as temperatures rise in the Northern Hemisphere, there's concern it could spread, along with the mosquitoes that carry it. But who's taking responsibility for this crisis and what are they doing to stop it? Today's newsmaker is the Zika virus, as we ask if the world is ready to cope with the fallout.
The alarm against viruses has been sounded many times before. And yet, the world is still unprepared to fight them. The battle against Ebola was one of the toughest and deadliest. And it's finally been declared over. But now the Zika virus is spreading across the Americas, testing global health services to try to contain one of the fastest growing outbreaks in recent years. It's the latest wake-up call that viruses remain one step ahead. Ebola caught West Africa off guard. The first cases were reported in March 2014 in southeastern Guinea. But it was not until August that the World Health Organization galvanized an international response, 5 months and 1,000 deaths later. The organization was criticized for delays, but it also emerged that some affected West African countries had too few doctors. And neither the WHO, the Center for Disease Control, nor the United Nations had deployable medical teams. The WHO has since revamped its strategy to tackle international outbreaks, like setting up a rapid reaction force and deepening research into infectious diseases. The idea is to be as prepared as possible, despite the certainty there will be new global outbreaks, like Zika. Critics say we really should have seen Zika coming. The mosquito transmitting the disease, the Aedes aegypti, has never been more numerous and has evolved to live closer to humans. After erupting in Brazil last year, Zika has now spread to over 25 countries, and more than 3,000 infected women have given birth to babies with microcephaly. This time, the WHO was quicker to alert the world.
And to have a tenfold increase in numbers and the potential for spread, not just across Latin America, but into Africa, into Asia, which have the highest birth rates in the world, we believe is a matter of public health concern and constitutes an international emergency.
Even if Zika is contained, the reemergence of any virus is still a threat. Scientists say creating vaccines against all bugs, however small, is the ultimate prevention. And countries are under pressure to invest in their health services. All of this will require billions of dollars in new funding. But it's a small price to pay compared to the catastrophic cost of acting too late. Sandra Gatman, The Newsmakers.
Joining me now to discuss if the world has been caught off guard by the Zika virus in Geneva is Dr. Sylvie Briand from the World Health Organization, and in London is virologist Dr. Rob Lampkin-Williams. Thank you, both of you, for joining us. Sylvie Briand, let's start with you. Is it harder to fight it because we don't quite understand it fully yet?
Well, it's often the case with new viruses, and this is the case for this one because the behavior of this virus has changed recently, and the alert has been given by Brazil, but still we are at the very early stage of the transmission of this virus into epidemics. And so, as for any new virus, there is always an initial phase where we need to collect information rapidly, trying to understand what is really happening.
And Dr. Briand, at the World Health Organization, do you believe that you have all the tools that you need to fight the virus and its aftermath?
So, this virus is transmitted by mosquitoes that are known, and since many years there have been already a program for vector control implemented to fight dengue or yellow fever or chikungunya viruses. So there is already some system in place to control the transmission of this virus. But certainly, because of the recent abnormalities and birth defects that have been diagnosed, we need to increase the response to this epidemic with additional measures, especially targeting pregnant women.
Dr. Lampkin-Williams, the World Health Organization calls it a global emergency. Do you think that that's the right approach?
Absolutely, 100%. Everyone accepts that the World Health Organization was too slow with Ebola. They've done a lot of restructuring recently, and they now have put new teams and that in place. And I think they were absolutely right to react as quickly as they have. Zika has been around for a very long time. It was first identified in 1940, in the 40s. It's only recently that we've seen these birth anomalies occur. In South America. And, the speed with which they've responded, I think, is actually quite impressive and is actually encouraging going forward. But we won't have a vaccine for several years. So the only options we have at the moment is protection. In other words, fumigation, mosquito nets for some mosquitoes. One of the problems with the Aedes mosquito is it actually flies around during the day. So mosquito nets don't really work because you can get it any time, and it will spread up to through the United States and across the Mediterranean in the same way that West Nile virus spread across the eastern coast of the United States to the west coast in about 3 years. So we've got a big problem here, but the World Health Organization have responded well to this.
Dr. Briand, just looking at the difference between Zika and Ebola, with Ebola, you're sick, you show those symptoms, you feel those symptoms immediately. With Zika, you do not, and according to all these studies, it shows that only about 20% of people actually show any symptoms at all. Just how dangerous, Dr. Briand, does that make Zika?
Well, Zika by itself, we still consider that it is a mild disease because, as you rightly said, not only very few people will show symptoms, but even if they show symptoms, this will be mild symptoms with fever, pain in the muscles and in the joint, and also sometimes some rash or conjunctivitis. But none of these people will die from Zika. The problem is really in the transmission of this virus to potentially the newborn babies and during pregnancy. And this causal relationship has not been completely established yet, but we have a strong suspicion that this virus can really damage newborns. So this is why now we consider that this as a risk, and that's why it was declared as a global emergency, because we need really to look into the complication of the disease.
Yes, strong correlation, no absolute empirical causation yet. However, we're seeing these cases of these poor babies. It's heartbreaking to look at these images of these little children suffering from the microcephaly. Rob Lampkin-Williams, do you believe that anyone anywhere thinking of having a baby should get tested for Zika?
There aren't any mass available tests at the moment. So, I mean, the advice is there are loads of travel advisories available at the moment for pregnant women. There's sexual health advisories. So somebody who's come back from an infected area should use condoms. I think the recommendation I saw this morning was for about 6 months afterwards, although we know the virus is only really in a person for about 14 to 28 days. But, you know, they're the sort of very precautionary measures that we're taking at the moment.
Sylvie Briand, when the news came out of Texas of the second confirmed case of sexual transmission of the virus, was there a scramble at the World Health Organization to maybe realign some of your priorities in trying to tackle this? Because initially it was only suspected that it was only mosquitoes that were carrying the virus?
Well, and I think this is where it's so important to be connected with the rest of the world, because this is what we do usually when we have a novel virus. There is always a lot of uncertainties, and the transmission patterns is part of those uncertainties, because before this virus was not, we had very few experience of epidemics, outbreaks before this one. And so not enough information really to conclude on some of the complication or even the transmission. Now that we have this suspicion as well of sexual transmission, it's clearly something that should be investigated. So it's difficult in countries where the virus seems to be endemic and circulating widely, but clearly with countries with very few cases, we can certainly investigate this mode of transmission. We don't know yet if this is a very common pattern of transmission or if it has been observed only on very sporadic cases. So this is still something that we need to investigate. But in the meantime, of course, we will recommend precautionary measures until we have more evidence and more certainty about how this virus transmits most commonly.
Dr. Briand, if it is a common pattern, if it becomes established that the sexual transmission of the virus is a common pattern, would you go as far as to say maybe perhaps Brazil needs to cancel the Rio Olympics?
Well, I think we do have capacities to also reduce and mitigate the risk of sexually transmitted diseases. Zika, if it happens to be a sexually transmitted disease, will not be the only sexually transmitted disease that we have currently. So I think we will certainly provide different types of advice so that we can cover also this risk of transmission. With regard cancelling Olympics, I think this is not yet something that we consider, because we really need first to gather more evidence and better understand how much of risk it is. If it's just sporadic cases, I mean, it really doesn't deserve the same attention as if it's a widely and commonly pattern of transmission.
Dr. Lampkin-Williams, how long until smart people like yourself can come up with a vaccine?
It's going to be a while, I'm afraid. I mean, normally it takes 5 to 10 years to get a vaccine developed. And there's been very little work. I think there are about 2 in the very early stages of development at the moment. So, I mean, you are looking at several years before a vaccine is going to be available. There is a vaccine for a similar virus called West Nile. Sorry, I would correct myself. There isn't a vaccine, there's an experimental vaccine, which might provide a platform to actually try to speed up research. But we are several years away from actually getting a vaccine for this virus. The main thing we can do is control and containment. So it's fumigation, as I said. Certainly mosquito nets, although I said this mosquito flies around during the day, there are other mosquitoes that will carry this virus that are around at night, so mosquito nets do have a role. DEET, mosquito repellents are important. Being covered up as much as possible, that's important. As far as the Rio Olympics go, pregnant women should be cautious, but I certainly wouldn't suggest cancelling them.
Dr. Sylvie Briand, we've had some very bleak news here. This is awfully depressing. Try to give us something positive here. What's the best case scenario of how we can hopefully arrest this horrible virus?
Well, first of all, I need to say that, following Ebola, we have been developing a blueprint for research. And of course, we are actively working on this to accelerate research. So it's true that in normal times, maybe the development of a vaccine could take 10 years. But in this particular case, we are really trying to accelerate the development of this vaccine. And we are very hopeful that it can come earlier and to be available for most people. I think the positive thing is that really we can be protected if we apply protection against mosquito bite. I think people are really protected, and so we encourage a lot to have not only community level measures to reduce the number of mosquitoes, but also if everyone starts using the individual protective measures such as repellent and long sleeves, I think already it will reduce a lot the transmission of the virus.
Okay. That's somewhat encouraging, not fully, but we can but hope. Thank you very much, Drs. Sylvie Briand and Rob Lampkin-Williams. We are out of time. Thanks again for joining us. Still to come on the Newsmakers, are megacities taking over the world? And in Picture This, the adverts taking center stage at the Super Bowl. 8 years ago, the United Nations announced that, for the first time ever, more people lived in cities than in rural areas. But what are the social and economic factors at play here? Why are people drawn to urban areas? And what does it mean for society? At the start of the 20th century, just 15% of the world's population lived in cities. Today, over 50% do, a figure that's rising by the day. And it's given rise to a new breed of metropolis, the megacity.
Welcome to the modern metropolis, teeming with millions of inhabitants. An economic and political hub, a cultural centre, an architectural and engineering wonder. A familiar sight now, but this level of urbanisation is a relatively recent development. In 1950, less than 3% of the world's population lived in cities with at least 5 million people. In 2015, that figure rose to more than 10%, and by 2030, it's forecast to surge to nearly 14%, with the bulk of them concentrated in southern and eastern Asia. The scale of this expansion has given rise to a new term, the megacity. It's defined as an area of continuous urban development with more than 10 million people. Although the concept was born in the West, megacities are dominating Asia's landscape. The continent is home to more than half of the world's 29 megacities. Tokyo takes the lead, followed by Jakarta, Delhi, Manila, Seoul, Shanghai, Karachi, and Beijing. China alone has 4, the most of any country in the world. In fact, the dragon has seen the biggest migration to the city in history, and analysts are forecasting this trend to continue.
China has not yet achieved a high level of urbanization, and there's still a lot of room and huge potential. If we make an effective plan of urbanization and roll out policies to go with it, the process of urbanization could be the main driver for the development of the country.
Like elsewhere, the pull factors to these sprawling urban zones are business and employment, and with that, the hope of better education, healthcare, and entertainment. The way these megacities are developing is changing the way we think about population and space. Some see a connection between powerful city-states, revolutionising infrastructure, and raising living standards for billions. But others are more cautious, warning of chaotic futures where people battle over scarce resources and increasingly congested areas. Many cities do fail to get the infrastructure right, creating transport, housing and pollution problems. Crime and poor access to services can also cause social problems if the gap between the rich and poor widens. But as emerging markets continue to thrive, these concrete jungles will keep spreading outwards and upwards. Yvette McCullough, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now is Joel Kotkin, an expert on urbanization from Chapman University. He's the author of a report called The Problem with Megacities, and his upcoming book, The Human City, is due for release in April. Thank you very much for joining us, Mr. Kotkin. Why aren't you a fan of megacities?
Well, the big problem with megacities, particularly in the developing world, is, as the report suggested, is the infrastructure is not there. I mean, if you try to get, let's say, from one part of Mumbai to another, well, good luck, because it will make the traffic of New York and Los Angeles and London seem like child's play. You have tremendous percentages of populations living in slums. So it's not necessarily that urbanization per se is a bad thing. It is how are we urbanizing and what are the costs of that? One of the big costs we find is that with people living in very, very crowded conditions, there are problems with disease, which are going to continue to happen because people living in unsanitary conditions. And then I think the biggest thing is long term, particularly in not just the developed countries, but in some of the developing countries, is when you urbanize, people stop having children. And that's good in the short run. In the long run, we're going to see more and more countries in the dilemma that Japan is in right now, where the population over 65 is already bigger than the population under 15, and by 2050, the population over 80 will be bigger than the population under 15. And that's largely a product of urbanization and density.
To make drastic changes, don't you have to almost rejig the entire model of modern industrialization? What's your alternative?
Well, I think there are alternatives that I think, for instance, Prime Minister Modi in India has been discussing about dispersing. In other words, having more people live in smaller cities. Let's try to figure out a way that we can find a way to plug villages and smaller towns into the global economy so that people can live a decent standard of living, that they can have some space, that they can have some connection to nature. I think, I've spent a lot of time in Singapore, which is probably the best run city in the world. And yet what you see there is a quality of life that leads people to not have children, to be pretty alienated, to be disassociated from nature in every way. And in China, you see it too. I mean, one of the interesting things is China got rid of its one-child policy, but it doesn't matter because a lot of people are having no kids. Because one of the big problems with megacities is property gets to be very expensive. You have very little space. There are health problems, and obviously in some countries, there are major crime problems. All I want to do is to start the discussion in a different place. Why don't we make cities so that they actually make people's lives better than sort of trying to jam them all together and create a situation that isn't working virtually anywhere.
Joel Kotkin, thank you very much. We are out of time. I'd love to continue discussing this issue with you, but unfortunately, I've got to wrap. Thanks so much for joining us. In today's Picture This, the Super Bowl is still a few days away, but some advertisers have already released this year's commercials. They're hoping that the ads will create a buzz on the internet and go viral. Let's take a look at some of this year's offerings.
Disgusting! You haven't heard me sing Diddly Ding yet. Dream on! Higher.
The day we adore is a day.
The day of reckoning is upon us! My brothers, what is life?
Today's newsmaker has been the Zika virus, a disease which, on the face of it, appears relatively harmless. But the links to microcephaly, which causes babies to be born with smaller heads and brains, have alarmed health authorities and prompted the World Health Organization to call it a global health emergency. And it's something that could get worse in the coming months as temperatures rise and the mosquitoes that carry it move further from the source. How severe it becomes will be determined by the response from both politicians and the WHO. Well, you've been watching this edition of the Newsmakers with me, Imran Gardner. As always, thank you for watching. See you next time. Bye-bye.